Brief announcements. There'll be no smoking in the auditorium. And the Augsburg Coffee House will be open afterwards. My name is Linda Elston. I'm a member of North Country Peace Campaign, which is a project of the New American Movement. I'd like to welcome you to this event, which is part of the International Week of Concern. Besides North Country Peace Campaign, groups that have been working on this whole week have been the Honeywell Project, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Clergy and Laity Concerned, and the American Friends Service Committee. These groups all form part of the United Campaign to End the War. Besides these groups, we've also been helped by the Twin Cities Women's Union and the National Lawyers Guild. During this week, there have been activities throughout the country in many cities, as well as internationally. Locally, we've participated in sponsoring a Vietnamese dinner, which raised over $260 for 7 Vietnamese students here in the United States who are presently facing deportation back to South Vietnam, where they face either imprisonment or maybe even be killed. We've also had displays in downtown Minneapolis and have been doing a number of radio interviews and newspaper interviews to publicize the Week of Concern to alert people to the continuing war in Indochina. At this point, I'd like to introduce Jane Fonda, an Academy Award-winning actress who helped found the Indochina Peace Campaign and has continued to be active in the anti-war movement. She's recently returned from her trip to North Vietnam and to the liberated zones in the South. She has also completed a movie on this trip, which will be released soon. Holly Near is an actress and a fine folk singer who has accompanied Jane Fonda and others on FTA shows, which stands for Free the Army, which toured several Army bases during the height of the war. She's also been on several Indochina Peace Campaign tours and has produced 2 albums, one of which, Hang In There, is composed of music which has been inspired by her experiences in doing these tours and in talking to the American people and by her experiences in the peace movement. That album can be purchased in the lobby outside. Finally, Daniel Ellsberg, formerly a Rand Corporation analyst who had been working in Vietnam. When he realized the truth about the war, he tried going through all of the channels in government, to the president, to members of Congress, with little success. Finally, he gave us, the people, the Pentagon Papers, making him the target of White House plumbers. Dan?
When I was traveling in the Pacific Rim entertaining GIs, one of our last stops was in Japan, and it was there I went on a tour of the Hiroshima Peace Park, which is a park that they've dedicated to peace. It's the place where the familiar mushroom was dropped, the one you see on picture postcards. And we were taken on a tour of this place, and by the time we were done seeing the relics left over from this tragedy and hearing stories like it was so hot when the bomb dropped that people ran to the river, but when they jumped in the river it was boiling, so they died anyway. And this went on for about an hour and a half, and I was finally at the end of my rope and was feeling really guilt-tripped, not by them but by myself, and feeling really bad about being white and from the United States. And the Japanese man looked at me and he said, "You white Americans are so hung up on a guilt trip that it immobilizes you, and you don't do anything. You just think about your genocidal past and decide it's easier to go and plant vegetables than to continue to struggle against that kind of a history." And it sort of put me in my place. And he said, "What I'm talking about is that you were not even alive when the bomb was dropped. So therefore you can't take a personal responsibility for that. but you are alive now, and something equally serious is going on that you were very much a part of. And he was talking about Vietnam. I'm a Vietnam baby. The United States has been involved there several years more than I've been alive. And when I came back here, I decided that as a singer and an actress, I wanted to do something culturally that involved Indochina, but I couldn't find anything to do. So I started writing my own songs. And if you'd like to sing along, it sounds a lot better with more people doing it. Why do we call them the enemy? This struggling nation we put in prison across the sea. And why do we want these people to die? Why do we say north and south? Oh, why, oh, why, oh, why? Well, that's just a lie. It's one of the many, and we've had plenty. I don't want more of the same. No more genocide in my name. Oh, my. Are our history books so full of lies when no word is spoken of why the Indian dies and dies and dies, or that the Chicanos love the California land? Do our books all say it was discovered by white man? We found that that was a lie. It's one of the many, and we've had plenty. I don't want more of the same. No more genocide in my name. Oh, why are the weapons of the war so young? And why are there only older men around when it's done? Why are so many of our soldiers black or brown? Do we say it's because they're good at cutting yellow people down? Well, that's just a lie. It's one of the many, and we've had plenty. I don't want more of the same. No more genocide, no, 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 no. No more genocide, no, 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 no. No more genocide, no, 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 no. No more genocide, oh, no, 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 no. No more genocide, oh, no, 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 no. No more genocide, oh, no, 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 no. No, that's just a lie. It's one of the many, and we've had plenty. I don't want more of the same. No more genocide in my name. Thank you. Going to do some more songs later, but we want to put it throughout the program because the songs are related very much to what each of the speakers are going to be saying, and it's I think sometimes it's more interesting to incorporate them all. So I'd like to introduce to you now a man who is it's a really great joy to travel with him, because whether it's 5 minutes on an airplane or a few minutes back behind the stage or while we're racing from one place to another, I never cease to learn something. It's today when I said that, Dan said, well, it's probably because I'm always lecturing, and what she's really saying is that I never be quiet. But in fact, it's a wonderful thing to have someone who can constantly re-inform you and has a new and exciting perspective on the things that happen every day in life and in the world. and never accepts that there's only one answer or one way to look at anything. And it's a very energizing way to think. Daniel Ellsberg.
I was just told by Holly that I should speak slowly and clearly because of the acoustics here, and I said, no, I've got so much I want to say here, and I can't take up all your time, I have to speak fast. And she said, all right, fast and clearly. So, can you hear me back there? Okay, if you can't, let me know, or if I talk too fast. Let me explain why I appear to be writing my speech at the last minute here. It's not a disrespect to your city or this audience, quite the contrary. Been traveling now for a little while with Jane Fonda, and her Indochina peace campaign did the scheduling tuned to her capabilities and energy level, and she is a different order of human being for me. And the result of that is that I got off the plane this afternoon in what I believe to be the Michigan airport. And I was walking through the aisle, and somebody had a microphone in my mouth, and they said, Bill Tilton is looking forward to interviewing you. I said, Bill Tilton, what's he doing in Ann Arbor? Said, has his parole officer let him move? And said, you're in Minnesota. I said, you know, Minnesota. And I grabbed for my fur hat, which I bought for rallies in Minnesota only. But it occurs to me that I'm glad to know that I'm not the only person in this entourage disoriented by Jane Fonda's schedule, because while I still thought I was in Ann Arbor, I went into the men's room at the airport, which was fairly full, and moments later we were joined by a token woman with red hair. This was Holly Neer, who was integrating the men's room at the Minneapolis airport in a fit of absence of mind. But we'll pull through, right? I first came to what excited me about now giving up the speech I was going to give in Ann Arbor and instead writing one for Minneapolis very fast here is that I have so many associations that bear on the war with Minneapolis and Minnesota and people from this town that I want to share those with you. Partly because I like to go over this history. Some of you in visits before for the Wounded Knee trial and others have heard me say some of this before. But as time and events move on, I think there's always something new to be learned from this story. So I think even you can bear hearing some of it again. It starts when I first came to Minneapolis for the first time at the Minnesota airport, where I met Ken Tilson. This was a long time ago, before the Wounded Knee trial even began, in January 1971. And he had called me there as an expert witness to testify in the trial of the Minnesota 8. Bill Tilton's trial, as part of that, had been a separate one. Mike Theriault, Frank Kroenke, Brad Benecke, Pete Simmons, Olson were all part of that. And I met during that visit not only those defendants in their draft raid trial, but their parents and their friends. I met Tilson at the airport, and he didn't know it, but I had in my suitcase in January 1971 several thousand pages of the Pentagon Papers. It was my hope, and I gave him a very vague clue to this, that by appearing as an expert witness testifying on what was to be learned about the government and why this war had to be opposed by methods that went beyond the normal rules of the game, the normal everyday practices, because we were in an emergency situation in which American democracy was at stake and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, some Americans and many, many more Indo-Chinese, were at stake. And our constitutional system was being ignored, and our restraints on arbitrary power had failed and were failing, and emergency action in support of the Constitution was necessary. That's what I understood the trial of these men, whom I hadn't yet met, was about. So I was proud to be part of that, but I also hoped that I would be able to give documentary evidence for the first time that this war was an illegal war based upon deception of Congress, obstruction of justice, violation of the Constitution, violation of international law, and every principle of human rights. Those are heavy charges to be making, not to be accepted from someone without some unusual credentials. That was a period when official credentials from the Defense Department or the White House meant more than anybody else's. That wasn't an earned respect. On the contrary, my colleagues and I myself had been abusing that trust for a generation. But the fact was that these were the kinds of charges likely to be listened to at all only from someone who had a background as a war criminal, as a conspirator in what I knew to be a criminal war. And I had that from the Rand Corporation, from the Pentagon, from the State Department, and from Vietnam. And I had documents to prove it, which had been in my safe under my authorized custody at the Rand Corporation until in October 1969, 5 years ago, 7 million tons of bombs ago, I decided to turn those over to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Correction, that wasn't 7 million tons ago. That was 4.5 million tons ago. At that time, the amount that had been dropped was basically what Lyndon Johnson had dropped, about 3.5 million tons. I learned to count time in this way by another one from another one of the Minnesota 8, Chuck Turchick. I don't know if I mentioned him. How many of you know these people or know Chuck here? You see? Chuck, I understand the ping pong champion of northern Minnesota around here, who was... Right, get back to that. Good question. And why didn't I do it as much as I did even later? That's what this talk is about, and I'll answer that. Turchick, when he was put into sandstone and other prisons, wrote letters to people when he wasn't practicing his ping pong in there, watching the war, and the date line on those letters was not in days. The date line from Sandstone Prison at the head of the letter was 6 million tons, 347,000, 7 million, and so forth. And that went on. Well, 69 was 3.5 million. We're talking now about January 71, a while later. About 5 million tons into the war and 2 million to go. 2 million under Nixon, 2 more million to go. The war wasn't over, just as it's not over now. In the meantime, from the time that I copied those papers, a good deal had happened. I gave them to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Fulbright. They promised hearings, but the hearings didn't take place because the president convinced people that he had changed Johnson's strategy and he was ending the war. Fulbright knew better. I knew better from inside information. But these documents didn't prove it because they only dealt with the Johnson and earlier administrations. They showed a pattern of deception which Nixon was continuing. I knew that, but I didn't have documents to prove it. The most I could do was put out documents that would suggest that other presidents had lied and maybe Nixon was doing it too. In the fall of '69, it looked as though that might end the war in the sense that it might change the political climate, allow Nixon to blame the war on the Democrats, who pretty well deserved it, and end it. But as he took a different course in late '69 and early '70, convinced people that he was ending the war, these documents no longer seemed relevant. Their promise no longer seemed very good. Nevertheless, other events came up. The risk seemed considerable. I didn't know what the law was at that point. I'd been told very often, wrongly, that I would be violating a law if I released those documents. That was a lie, one more lie, but I didn't know that yet. I talked to lawyers about this time, late in the game, and they told me, in effect, that although they couldn't find any law that I seemed to have broken, the idea of copying 7,000 pages of top-secret documents had a bad ring to it somehow, and that a jury might feel that it had a bad ring to it in sort of an uneasy way, and that I had about a 50% chance of about 20 years in prison if the Senate brought them out, and much higher if anybody else brought them out. Nevertheless, I went ahead. When the Senate failed to bring those papers out in investigations, I tried other things. I went to other senators, individual senators. I went to a conference sponsored by your Congressman Don Fraser, among other things, on war crimes, and got the idea there that maybe, now that that conference actually taught me that what I had here were documentary evidence of war crimes. So I began to dream of what looked otherwise impossible, a war crimes trial. If necessary, I said to some lawyers, I could be a defendant in it, but we'll get these papers out. Get them out in an authoritative way. It seemed to be the only effective way to do it, and it lowered the risks down to 50, 60, 70% or 20 years in prison or more. When they finally hit me with an indictment for 115 years, I don't think they really meant to keep me away for 115 years. With good behavior, as Chuck Turchik and the others know, I would have gotten out in 35. But it was enough to take seriously, especially because as time went on, it did seem decreasingly likely that these things could do any good. History was further away in the past, and Nixon was more and more committed to what he was doing. And so we come up to January of 1971, the trial in Judge Neville's courtroom. I told Tilson that I had some documents. I didn't tell them that they were thousands of pages of top secret documents. Actually, they weren't by that time. They had been marked top secret till my son and daughter and Tony Russo helped me cut off the top secret markings from top and bottom with a paper slicer in sort of a cottage industry we had running in an advertising agency nights. And as a matter of fact, I just noticed the date is October 4th. I started this on October 1st. And I remember October 4th, which was a couple days later, very well. It was a night when my son was there. He was only there a couple times because I wanted him to sort of see what was happening, why I was doing this, in case I thought the papers would then come out very shortly. I'd be in jail and I might not see him again except in jail. And I wanted him to see what was going on here and to remember that. Anyway, we were busy and there was all these clippings all over the floor, top secret that we'd clipped out and everything. And I looked out at about 2 in the morning and 2 policemen in blue uniforms were walking into the room. And it turned out that Linda Siné, who owned this advertising agency, had turned the key wrongly in her burglar alarm, so that when we came in, she had set off the alarm in the police station. And these police were investigating. So we told them it was all right, no problem. And they left. And so the next night, that would be October 5th or 5 years ago tomorrow night, I was doing the Xeroxing at a machine next to a glass door, and the stairway came up to this glass door. And I was turning the 1,000th page or so, and I looked up, and next to me were 2 more policemen in blue. So I knew the drill by this time, of course, what this was about, and I waved, and we had the door locked, and I covered over the top secret part and let them in, assured them there was no problem, and so forth. I'll mention this to say that if you think the plumbers were amateurs or bunglers, it takes one to catch one. And the truth was that when they finally did get on to this, they were very puzzled by our modus operandi in general. They found it hard to understand me and my associates, which was partly why they went into the doctor's office to see what. Tony Russo later made a technical advance of putting strips of cardboard over the top and bottom of the Xerox glass, covering the top secret. So you got instant declassification when you Xerox this thing, which I pass on to anybody. I went into Judge Neville's courtroom then, having conferred with Tilson and told him that I hoped to be asked to provide documents that would substantiate my claims of government lying and criminality. And I would then produce these on court order. He didn't know what they were. I just said I had documents backing up what I had. So he asked me, he said the important thing here, and I certainly agreed, was to make my testimony as weighty as possible in terms of authority. So we went through my background and the Marines and the Pentagon and this and that. And he asked me if I had done any work for the Nixon administration, which he said would count for a great deal more than this earlier stuff. I said, well, actually I had, but I had never spoken about that publicly for the reason that was while I was at the Rand Corporation, and I did do some significant consulting work in the very first months of the Nixon administration, first couple of months. But that Henry Kissinger was very sensitive about the fact that he'd used outside help on this, and particularly that I had been the man in charge of it, involved because I was already known to be a critic of the war at that point when he used me. So not to embarrass Rand, I had never said that publicly, and I said we just can't go into that. Well, the next morning, I was up early, the time difference, and I called my answering service at home to see if there was anything, and there was a call from Don Oberdorfer of the Washington Post. And incidentally, this call was later traced by the FBI in this guy's house, but they've never heard exactly what we discussed, I think. So I'll put that on the record now. Oberdorfer said he was doing a study for the Washington Post of the first 2 years of the Nixon administration policy. And then Henry Kissinger had just told him the day before that, as a matter of fact, Dan Ellsberg, who was now a critic of the war, had played, this was before the Pentagon Papers had come out, but I had been making public appearances. And he said, had told him that Henry Kissinger had said that Dan Ellsberg had played an important role in the formulation of options at the beginning of the administration. I was astounded. I said, Kissinger told you that himself? And he said, yes, definitely. I said, okay, I'll call you back then. I'll talk if that's the case, but after this trial. I went into the courtroom and I told Tilson that it was now okay to ask me if I'd worked for the Nixon administration. He did so, and for the first time I said, yes, I have never spoken of this earlier, but I did do consultant work for the administration at the beginning. We moved on. Theriault and Kroenke were defendants. Kroenke was representing himself. And we got to the point then when I was asked, had I worked on the war, was I familiar and so forth? Had the dissent, had acts of resistance ever had any effect on policy making of people inside the Pentagon? I said, yes, it is a fact, and there is documentary evidence to prove that fact, that the prospect of draft resistance of the very sort charged in this case did influence decisions not to put an extra 200,000 men in Vietnam, which in turn would probably have led to the invasion of North Vietnam, given a commitment of 700,000 to 1 million men. And that in turn, I believe, would have led to the use of nuclear weapons. I can't frankly remember whether I got all of this out over objection, but I got the gist of that. We went on, and that was, of course, the point here, that what Theriault and Kroenke had done, as I sincerely believed, had been relevant to the question of this ongoing, deceptive, and unconstitutional war. Now, I wasn't allowed to use those terms because when the point came as to what I had learned from these documents, I started to say, those documents prove that government officials lied to the American people. And at this point, I was cut off very angrily by the judge, the late Judge Neville, who turned to Tilson and said, I told you in letting these witnesses on that I would hear no criticism of the government in this trial. Now, that's where it was at in January 71. This was the first trial that had allowed expert testimony to be presented bearing on the war, although in the end, Judge Neville told the jury to ignore it. But he did hear it. That was a first. That's why I was there. And yet, in January 71, 5 million illegal tons of bombs into that war, no criticism was to be heard in that federal courtroom in Minnesota when 2 men were on trial for avowedly having possessed a rather critical attitude toward the government policy. And that's what they were being tried for. We had a fairly clear sense at that point that their chances of acquittal were not too good. So they did go to prison, all of them. I went back with my suitcase full of documents, and time went on. I was asked earlier, a minute ago, why I didn't give, say, the Pentagon Papers earlier. The first answer is that I did not have them earlier. I copied them the month I got the bulk of them and gave them. Second, more importantly, I hadn't read them earlier. And reading, especially the early parts, didn't teach me anything about how bloody the war was. I knew that. I'd seen it. I had been there. I'd seen the blood on both sides. But you know, as we keep being told by our government, war is hell, war is bloody. We've been in a war so bloody the one that Holly Near referred to in her opening remarks, and considered so just, World War II, that the American public had learned from it that there was no limit to the amount of blood, even innocent blood, that we could justifiably kill. We could justifiably spill if the president decided that it was necessary. That's what we learned from Hiroshima and the other bombing. And I'd grown up during that, and I'd learned that too. The point of those early parts of the Pentagon Papers for me were that they stripped the war of every shred of legitimacy of the kind that had been associated with World War II. They said, for this killing by the United States, there is no good reason. So it is wrong and it must stop. And when I read that, as I say, I went pretty quickly at that point to the Xerox machine and turned it over to the Senate, hoping that they would stop it. I did that expecting that I would go to prison, as I say, for a very long time and very quickly. I've told you an intellectual thing that happened in my mind at that point. But intellectual discoveries like that probably aren't enough to move people to change their lives quite that much. I'd been protesting the war and resisting the war in various ways for 2 years at that point, since coming back from Vietnam with hepatitis. But inside the system, which I thought was the way you did it, tell the president that he's doing it wrong and hope that he'll change his policy. What I was doing now was going beyond the president, which alone was a tremendous change in my career, which had been spent always working for the president. And I learned that from the Pentagon Papers. But how do you, having learned that you should do it, where do you find the impulse to do it? I happen to know that in this case, it was very much the example of one person in particular, happened to be named Randy Keeler of the War Resisters League, whom I'd met just a month earlier, just before I learned the information that Nixon was about to continue the war, and just before I coincidentally read the Pentagon Papers. And Keeler was on his way voluntarily to prison, where he spent 2 years, for failing to give his address deliberately to the draft board as a gesture of resistance to this war, because he felt that he conscientiously could not take part in what he knew to be a murderous war and had to resist it as usefully as he could. And that was the only way that was open to him. Well, his act had the kind of effect he hoped on at least one person, because I realized I faced the same belief that he did. There was something I could do. It would probably send me to prison, but I had no good reason for being less willing to go than Keeler was. And so at that time, I did accept that likelihood. All right, as I say, the effectiveness of this act seemed to go down month by month, the possible effectiveness. And the risks, to some degree, went higher and higher as I contemplated going beyond the Senate. So, whereas a lot of people have assumed that when I finally gave the Pentagon Papers to the newspapers, it was because I either didn't expect to go to prison, which is certainly wrong, or because I was sure it would end the war, which would be crazy, naive, ingenuous. That's just wrong. I wasn't that foolish by any means. I was already aware that this war had gone on not 5 years and not 10 years, but going on, was over 25 years old at that time. That's what I learned from the papers. And I did not learn from that the lesson that a 25-year-old war is easy to end. It was getting harder to end, but it was getting bigger and more desperate to end. So you had to do something. Laos invasion came, the spring of 1971. I knew shortly beyond that was likely the possible invasion of North Vietnam and the other consequences I've mentioned. The situation was simply more desperate than before. The promise was less, but I had a new example of Keeler, to add to that of Keeler of 2 years before. Cronky, Theriot, Simmons, Turchik, the others, now in jail in Minnesota. I think I needed that new example to remind me that I hadn't yet done everything I could. And you had to take a bigger risk. I gave the papers to the newspapers at that point, something I was told by my lawyer, whom I had at that point, at a very high risk. again, still couldn't find a law that it had broken, but as he said, it didn't look good somehow, and they couldn't find a precedent for it. And to show the sort of desperation involved at that point, I was simply doing anything I could think of doing. May Day came along. I sat in the street, 14th Street in Washington. A day later, I sat in a sit-in at Federal Building in Boston. I admired the people who were doing all those things, and I was glad to be with them. I thought they were doing what they could, and everybody had to do that. And the truth was that I thought that the promise of the Pentagon Papers, when they finally came out, was roughly comparable to the effect I was going to have by being one more person in May Day. It was just one more thing to do. I want to add one thing on why this did seem so urgent. What Oberdorfer told me back here in Minnesota after I got out of Neville's courtroom was that Kissinger had said, as I say, that I had played some role in devising this strategy. I said, well, what did he tell you the strategy was? He said, well, it's negotiating with Hanoi, withdrawal of American troops, and turning the remaining war over to the Vietnamese. I said, that's a lie. If that were the policy, I would still be at the Rand Corporation, which I'd left. I didn't tell him, and I wouldn't have copied the Pentagon Papers. That wasn't public yet, to him. But I said, that's not the policy. I said, that's the overt policy. There is a secret policy which is being carried on, of which Cambodia is part and Laos is going to be part. I was already clear that Laos was the next step. A policy of threatening Hanoi secretly, threatening their allies, China and Soviet Union, secretly. That is, threats that they knew of, they heard, but that the American public did not hear of. And backing up those threats with actual escalations, starting with the bombing of Cambodia in early '69, of which I knew, without documents, unfortunately. I said, that is a secret policy to win the war, and those supposed negotiations are in fact a collection of secret threats and secret bombing escalations that are expanding the war in hopes not of ending it, but of winning it. It is going to fail. Eventually there will be offensives from the other side, and this war will get very large, and that is why I left Rand, and that is why I'm doing what I can to end this war. Pentagon Papers came out. The fact that presidents lied was no longer a secret. I don't think I would have been thrown out of Judge Neville's courtroom after that month, or thrown off any talk show after that month, as I would have been earlier, for suggesting that presidents lied, past presidents. Still, how about Nixon? The documents didn't say anything about Nixon. I said he was lying and was expanding the war, but I didn't have documents to prove it. I was just saying it. I knew that Nixon knew he was lying. But did he know I knew? I didn't know that. It turns out that he did know. He had heard what I was saying. His eye was on the sparrow. And I was the only one saying it publicly, and he was giving me a lot of attention, especially after the Pentagon Papers came out, especially because of something he didn't know. He didn't know I didn't have documents that I could prove this with, more documents. So he got very, very concerned. Henry Kissinger, who had just a few months earlier been inviting me to Washington to do more options work. He invited me at San Clemente, come at government expense, to do work on more options for the president, which I did not do. This was a few months earlier. Well, Henry Kissinger came in to tell them what he knew of Daniel Ellsberg as soon as the Pentagon Papers came out. He was the only one who knew me. He said, this man is a dangerous fanatic. We have this from the transcripts now in the Ehrlichman memos. He's a drug abuser, he said, and he gave them FBI reports they'd been collecting that said from various people that I was obsessed with sex. I showed this to my wife, and she said, well, that's right. He's known to consort in the last year with communists, people communistic. Well, right again. It is not to the credit of the central wing of the Democratic Party that you met more communists than Democrats running rallies against the war during that period. So having alerted them to the danger of his former consultant, in the White House. They hired Hunt and Liddy. 2 days after I was indicted for the first time, Colson was on the phone to the supposedly, allegedly retired CIA agent Howard Hunt, testing him out for employment on my case. He said, what do you think of the Ellsberg prosecution? We have the transcript of this because Colson taped it and later gave it to the prosecutors. And Hunt says, well, I want to see the guy hung, if it can be done to the advantage of the administration, he said. And Colson said, tell me, on the phone, tell me, do you think the guy is a lone wolf? And Hunt says, yeah, I think he was a lone wolf, except, of course, for the Eastern establishment, he said. Well, it takes a CIA man to understand really large conspiracies. And would that he had been right about this one. I felt more lonely than that. But anyway, Hunt and Liddy got together. They did get material from General Cushman, my former regimental commander in the Marine Corps, who is now head of CIA, deputy head of CIA. They got cameras and burglary equipment and wigs and voice alterers and so forth. And in an effort with Cuban Americans fully worthy of our Xeroxing expertise in Los Angeles, they went back to Los Angeles, broke into the doctor's office, tore it up, trying to find material with which to blackmail me and shut my mouth about what I was saying. They knew that they could not convict me in a trial by that time. They had now studied the law with better access than we'd had in our library and had proven to themselves what we had begun more and more to suspect, that I had broken no law. For the reason, as we finally learned, that the First Amendment of the Constitution bars Congress from passing a law that would make illegal what I had done, telling the truth to Congress, telling the truth to the American public. They had tried to keep the Constitution a secret, that aspect, from people. And of course, I knew very little about the Constitution when I went into the case. I'd worked for the executive branch all my life. I didn't think it applied to me. I worked for the president. So I learned a good deal during the trial, expensively, but they learned also, and they knew they couldn't win that trial. The conception that I'm free today because Hunt and Liddy bungled a burglary happens to be quite wrong. I'm free because I'm an American citizen under the American Constitution, and there is no law that I had broken. The jury, thank God, which exists under the American Constitution as an element in this process, had become aware of that in the 5-month trial and was about to acquit me when the trial was dismissed because of governmental misconduct. We learned that from talking to the jurors afterwards. But anyway, they'd learned that earlier, which of course is why they needed to do other things to me, to keep the secret that I was telling, the secret that the war was not ending and was going to get larger, which I was still telling, despite the China trip, which convinced the China promise, which convinced everybody the war was about to end. They had nosed around with all these FBI people, every girlfriend I'd had in the years when I was a bachelor. They had found this sexual obsession and so forth. But I didn't seem to be tremendously secretive about it, and it didn't look good enough for blackmail. So they wanted to find something that I would only tell my analysts, that they could then warn me would come out publicly if I didn't shut up. There was really only one way to keep me to shut up. Blackmail me, which in fact could not have worked. There was no way to blackmail me out of telling what I knew. Or kill me, or lay me out. My wife used to worry that that was a possibility. She didn't like me to go to very large audiences, and those were days when a lot of people came to rallies. I spoke to one audience of 18,000 people in the sports arena in Los Angeles, and my wife was very worried about that. And I respected her worry, but I really thought it was exaggerated. I thought, the government doesn't do that, I don't think. Well, I was wrong. Magruder tells a story in his new book, and Hunt has testified now, in fact all the Cuban Americans have testified, that in the spring of 1972, just before my trial was to begin, when I was to speak at a rally on the steps of the Capitol to protest the bombing of Haiphong, which I knew would shortly precede the mining of Haiphong, Colson called from the White House to the Creep headquarters to Magruder. Magruder passed it on to get people to beat me up. Magruder passed this on to Liddy to Hunt to Barker. Barker hired 10 Cuban friends in Miami, including one, Martinez, who was currently on the active payroll of the CIA and had been for all of these operations. He was not dropped from the CIA payroll until after the Watergate burglary, in which he was caught. He was debriefing to his case officer all during this time. They brought them up from Miami, first class, with orders to punch me in the nose as I first heard the story and call me a traitor. They were told that the reason they were to do this was that J. Edgar Hoover, having in fact died just the day earlier, long after the rally was scheduled, and his body was lying in state on the other side of the Capitol from the rally, they were told that this was a rally to protest J. Edgar Hoover, and they were to beat me up to protect the catafalque of J. Edgar Hoover from desecration by me. This is, they suspected a kind of necrophilia or something. These Cubans, having always worked, every one of them, for CIA throughout their careers, had a very high tolerance for cover stories, and they were kind of uncritical about what Hunt told them, and they believed that. What I learned more recently was that their orders were not just to punch me in the nose, but to beat me up very thoroughly. And that first gave me the clue as to why the Nixon administration had been quite so interested in me, which I hadn't realized till this information rather late in the game. I really hadn't figured out why were they so interested in one anti-war person among so many. Jane was there, she'd been at this longer than I had. Judy Collins, various people were appearing at this thing. Why was I the one who was just about to go on trial, who was be singled out? And then I remembered the date. It was May 3rd, 1972. Just after, a few days after Haiphong was being bombed, Haiphong was about to be mined, and more significantly, that mining was to be accompanied by the obliteration of North Vietnam. One more piece of history, which has just come out to me in the last 2 weeks. And I can give references on this, but a piece that was just published revealed that Henry Kissinger had planned the obliteration bombing of North Vietnam for execution in October 1969, the month I was copying the Pentagon Papers. I thought though plans like that at that time existed, but were for 3 years away, as they finally turned out. I was wrong. They were planned to go into effect that fall, and what stopped them was the fact that on October 15th, the largest rallies ever held were held all over the nation in the October 15th moratorium. And Chapin, Haldeman, and others concluded that if they carried out their obliteration plans, which were to break the threshold of pain of North Vietnam, the November 15th rally, with the communists and the Trotskyists and the Quakers and everybody, even Democrats, were going to hold, would be the biggest ever held and would be too much. And that prospect stopped that plan for 2.5 years. But I'm telling you something when I say that I did not know 3 weeks ago. And very few people, I'm sure, have drawn that inference from what I've read. You have to be able to put it all together. That's why we need these tapes and this history, to understand our own past history so as to understand our future and to change it. The reason that I'm going into these stories, and I have just a couple more anecdotes, is because I think they bear very closely on the strongest problem facing us at this moment, in this room and in this country. You know here what a lot of people in the country do not know, I'm sure, that the war goes on and that it is still our war. The media is cooperating once again in an ominous, disastrous cover story that the war is over. I don't think you believe that. But there still remains the question, can we do anything about it? And the very fact that it's going on poses a challenge. It suggests a negative answer, that the American people don't care about bombing other people, don't care about the war, or that, and thus are part of the problem, or that nothing works, nothing makes any difference. What I'm talking about tonight is meant to bear on that serious question. I want to examine with you, what I'm doing is examining with you the history of this war, and especially of the last 2 years, for suggested answers to the question of how can we change the future of war with Indochina and with other places. And I say the last 2 years especially because the year and a half of the peace accords is, as you know, one of the bloodiest chapters of the war. And Watergate, and this is less known, except to me and a few others, Watergate is also a chapter in the history of the war, as perhaps you're gathering from what I'm saying. Anyway, I now had the answer to why it was necessary to not just to punch me in the nose, which would have made no meaning, but to shut me up on May 3rd. The mining came on May 8th. That was 1 month out of the war when it was useful to them to shut me up for 1 week, because I was saying that mining was coming, that it was not a response to an unprovoked offensive. On the contrary, I was saying that we had been bombing since '69, that we had been planning this escalation, and that we were going higher, and we'd been planning it for 2.5 years. The president had in mind a highly stage-managed performance, that he was meeting a challenge from the other side and saving us from humiliation. I was inconvenient in that scheme, and it was important that I shut up just then. Well, unfortunately, they turned to the same guys who had done the Fielding break-in, basically, and the Bay of Pigs 10 years earlier, and they did not get through my protective screen of Judy Collins and Jane Fonda. And Judy Collins actually was one of those who pulled people off as they got into a fist fight on the edge of the crowd, which suggests to me why Castro is still in power. These are the guys who had tried to overthrow him for Kennedy. And the thing does sound funny in its way, except that I do have a suspicion that what we've learned about is the one that failed, the bungle, the bunglers. I do not draw from that the President of the United States cannot get someone beat up, or I have to say now, killed by CIA assassins if he wants to. So a lot of looking into is necessary. I have to say that my head has been turned around on that point, because here we have an instance of people paid for by campaign funds, illegally contributed by a Minnesotan, incidentally, Dwayne Andreas's funds, laundered through Mexico, paying Liddy to bring CIA active employee, one of them, and others who had all worked for the CIA and believed they were still working for the CIA, up to Washington to beat an American citizen up on the steps of the Capitol while he was protesting an illegal escalation of the war. It was rather a neatly framed, instructive episode. And of course, Nixon has done more to instruct us as to the potential for the abuse of power by an American president than I could ever have done or the president could ever have done. Well, I didn't know any of this at the time. I'd heard the scuffling, I'd heard the traitor calls, but I didn't feel any blows, so I went home and waited for the mining to start. That was the lowest weekend of my life. I can't even talk of it now, I find. But something I'd tried to prevent for 2.5 years was about to take place, and I'd been totally impotent to have any effect on it, despite the Pentagon Papers, despite the notoriety, despite 19 newspapers defying federal injunctions. I had not been able to convince anybody that this was something that was coming and had to be stopped, and it happened. Haiphong was mined, which was of little significance in itself, but the bombing, for which that was a cover and a distraction, the bombing started, and the dikes started, a taste of dike destruction started, and they were heading for the obliteration strategy. Then I went into trial. That trial was broken off by a discovered wiretap. I talked all over in the fall, all over the place. I found IPC, Indochina Peace Campaign, literature being passed out by other people who were fighting the feelings of passivity and despair and paralysis in the rest of the country, and were doing what they could to inform their citizens with little hope that it might work, but because that was a useful way to spend their lives, and I respected those people very much. But the election came, the landslide came, and then the bombing of Hanoi came, and that was the next lowest period of my life. and then we went into trial. None of this, it seemed, had been prevented. We'd gotten a big run for our money in various acts of resistance, gotten a lot of publicity out of the Pentagon Papers, but it didn't seem to have stopped anything. Nevertheless, the bombing of Hanoi did stop, mysteriously. People said it was Congress. I found that rather hard to believe at the time. But it did stop, and there was a peace treaty, which I thought might be obeyed. We went into trial, and now I'm getting near the end of my tale, wraps it up, because we come back to a Minnesota theme. I was sitting, can you hear me, by the way? Okay? It's hot in here, I know. I was sitting in my courtroom in about the 3rd month of the 5-month trial, and I heard my lawyer refer to Kroenke versus Minnesota, an appellate case that Frank Kroenke had argued himself in front of the appeals court of Minnesota, of the Minnesota 8 trial. He was using an argument that we were not relying on at all, but which we were making the basis of a subsidiary motion, actually to get some discovery material, to get some documents. And the argument that Frank had presented was based on the notion that you have a right to break what would otherwise be a law, commit a violation of a law, to prevent a greater evil. That was the Minnesota 8's basic defense. They had done what they could, what they did, which was break into draft boards and destroy draft records, to alert their fellow citizens of Minnesota and the country that people were being sent to kill and die wrongly. Do that in a dramatic way and prevent that evil. Stop it. Wake their countrymen up. This kind of defense goes back to the 19th century. First case seems to have been a mutiny case on a ship. Very, very serious offense in those days, a sailing ship. The crew claimed that the ship was leaking and taking water when it left port and was beginning to sink in a storm. They forced it to go back to port, and they were all saved. Many of them testified that the ship was leaking and was taking water and was about to sink. The captain and first mate testified under oath that it wasn't leaking at all. There was no problem. It all seemed sort of familiar in terms of Vietnam, but in any case, that was the argument. Now, Nesson pointed out, my lawyer pointed out, Your Honor, this appellate court case failed in Minnesota because the judges held that there was not a sufficient causal chain, causal link, between the acts committed by Kroenke and his fellow defendants in going into that draft board and a reasonable way to end the war. It wasn't a necessary thing like dynamiting a road to prevent a flood coming somewhere else or something like that. Stealing a life preserver to give to a drowning person. But Nesson said, but Your Honor, in this case, this argument for our limited purpose here is obviously sound because obviously putting out the Pentagon Papers was reasonably related to the evil sought to be avoided, ending the war. Even though, as we all knew at that defense table, it hadn't ended the war. And I sat there thinking of Frank Kroenke, who was then in Sandstone, and I wrote a note to my lawyer which said, I am part of that causal chain for Frank, because his action, like Randy Keeler's action, had had exactly the effect on at least one American that they hoped it would have. It had helped me to do further acts, take further risks beyond those higher risks beyond those I'd already taken, on the basis of their example, which had awakened me to the continued need for further risks. That's what they wanted to do, and they did that, and I thought, for what it's worth, they caused the Pentagon Papers to be put out in the newspapers. For what it's worth. It frankly and realistically didn't look worth a whole lot at that point, but I wrote that to Frank in hopes that it would make him feel better sitting in prison, that it had some effect. Well, a month or two later, Frank's act, and Theriault and Benekes and the others, through me, had had a greater effect. I should say through Richard Nixon, because the effects of what I did, and Tony Russo and others who helped me, on Richard Nixon had quite a bit of effect. I overstimulated Richard Nixon, And he went into a flurry of illegal actions, and then actions to cover up those lies and illegalities, which, starting on April 27th with the disclosure of the burglary, began to tear his administration to pieces. Let me sum up. Why had Nixon tried so hard to keep those plans secret? Why had he lied so much? Why had he feared people like me, people like Frank Cronkite and Theriault and Beneke and Turchik so much? And why had he tried so hard to keep what he did secret? You'll hear all the time the inference that he was simply irrational, paranoid. He was oversensitive to criticism. The people who write that simply don't know, even yet, what I knew from '69 on and what Richard Nixon knew from '69 on, that he had a secret plan that he was carrying out that had to be kept secret. At least he thought so. Maybe if he'd been open about it, the American public would have supported the Cambodian invasion, the bombing, the 4.5 million tons of bombs that he dropped, twice as much as World War II, and far more than even Lyndon Johnson had dropped. Maybe they would have, but we don't know because he didn't want to find out, just as his predecessors had never wanted to find out. That's flattering to the American people, but I think he was right. He understood correctly, I believe, what a lot of the media does not yet understand, and congressmen yet do not understand, that the American people, unlike the Rockefellers and the Nixons, do not approve of wars against self-determination of other countries. Do not approve of secret wars in Cambodia and Laos, secret bombing wars dropping hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs and employing tens of thousands of secret mercenaries, Thais, Laos, and others. They do not approve of coups and assassinations. Hence, it is necessary to lie to them if you propose to do those things. As Nixon, with the full support of many members of Congress, the press, the courts, and behind them, the men of power in this country and wealth, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the others, those don't have to be lied to. Those understand the policy and want it. It's their policy and it serves them. But the American people have to be lied to. The second point is they do not accept being lied to. And when they find out they've been lied to, it's dangerous for the president. The president was rational in what he did, given his aims of holding on to Saigon and preventing self-determination in Saigon, and he was rational to lie about it, and he was rational to hide those lies. And when they all fell apart, he conducted a fairly skillful defense till the roof fell in. But something more important than all of that even happened. As the description of federal lies came apparent to Congress, and this was while I was still on trial, Congress did something that I did not foresee their ever doing. They found the guts to do the kind of thing that the Frasers and the Aberesks and the Abzugs had been proposing for a long time, to cut off the funds for the Cambodian bombing, and that bombing was ended by Cambodian action. As a result of the discovery of the illegal actions to which the president was drawn in a panic of the Pentagon Papers when he discovered that officials might begin to tell the American people the truth about what we were doing in Vietnam. The moral of that story, I think, applies to the situation right now. As Jane will tell you in detail, and as you know, really, I'm sure, American bombing still goes on, not by American pilots that we know of, and none of us here can be sure that that is the case, but certainly by Vietnamese pilots that we pay in American planes that we pay for and provide, dropping American-made bombs that we pay for and provide. They are still killing people all over Indochina. It is as wrong and murderous as it ever was in the last 29 years, and we must stop it before it goes on another year, another 100,000 tons of bombs. The moral of the story I've told tonight bears on the question of whether actions by individuals and actions by masses of people can make a difference. They have not yet ended the war, that 29-year-old war going on 30. But I believe that it was this resistance to the war of all kinds, liberals, moderates, radicals, in the streets of Washington, peacefully in October and November of '69, moved by more radical actions in many cases, which postponed that obliteration bombing of North Vietnam by 2.5 years and postponed the B-52 bombing of Hanoi by 3 years. Postponed it till after an American election, not before. And that meant that it came so late in the war that even the president understood that he had been beaten by the Vietnamese resistance and by the American resistance, and ended his genocidal strategy at that point after only 2 weeks of bombing, murderous bombing, under pressure indeed from Congress, moved by public pressure. We hadn't ended the war, but the people who in those rallies and the people who stimulated the people in those rallies had saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And that meant it was all worth it. Nothing that had been done by you in this room, and I thank you for all that you've done. From Brad Beneke, who's in this audience, and Tilton, who helped me find what to do, and all the others who've been part of it. Ken Tilson, who defended them, and everybody else. Nothing they did was too much or too soon. Every bit of it was essential. None of it was wasted. It was all necessary. I thank you for having done it. The effects, I can't, before I close, I want to take 1 minute and refer to a document just handed me before I came in, which was why I was just looking through it. A different judge, several years later, several years more of Pentagon history, Vietnam history, Watergate history had happened in Minnesota, and a new courthouse in Minneapolis. Very different judge, Fred Nickel, but also a different era. The Wounded Knee trial, in which the defense rested on a trail of broken treaties. It goes back even longer than the treaty we broke in '54 in Laos and the treaty we're breaking today that we signed in '63. Treaty that involving the Indians. And I find, looking through here, and I'm very pleased by this, very proud of this, to have been part of this causal chain, Judge Nickel saying, first reading something that I think hadn't been read in a federal courtroom for a long time. Justice Sutherland's opinion. The United States Attorney, a member of the executive branch, is the representative not of an ordinary part to a controversy, but of a sovereignty whose obligation to govern impartially is as compelling as its obligation to govern at all, and whose interest, therefore, in a criminal prosecution is not that it shall win the case, but that justice shall be done. Means and Banks and a lot of other people in the last 3 years had reminded one federal judge of principles of justice in our Constitution and our constitutional law that had been missing from courtrooms through the Nixon administration and before that. As such, he is the servant of the law, and not only attorney generals, but presidents. He may prosecute with earnestness and vigor, said Justice Sutherland. Indeed, he should do so, but while he may strike hard blows, he is not at liberty to strike foul ones. It is as much his duty to refrain from improper methods calculated to produce a wrongful conviction as to use every legitimate means to bring about a just one. And therefore, he said, therefore, it is fair to say I am now over the brink of dismissal, said Nickel, as you know, a couple weeks ago. Now, Matt Byrne, said Judge Nickel, I should call him Judge Matt Byrne. I have to call him Judge Matt Byrne. He calls him Matt Byrne. Of the Southern District of California, in the Ellsberg trial, granted what was in effect a judgment of dismissal. There was no appeal from that judgment. And the reasons that he gave, I studied carefully. I'm glad to say I brought those reasons. I brought our brief to this courtroom here at Kunstler's request and was ready to answer questions from Nickel, and also Judge Byrne's opinion, which he did study. Judge Nickel concluded that he should do what Judge Byrne had done. Judge Byrne's dismissal was the first in history dismissal of a case for government misconduct. Nickel's is the second. He said, this is an unusual situation. This was in dismissing the Wounded Knee case. Judge Matt Byrne had an unusual situation confront him in connection with the Ellsberg trial. There have been very few cases like his, and I hope there won't be any more. There have been very few cases like mine, and I hope there won't be any more. And that case was dismissed. Okay. I think I've told you why there won't be any more if there aren't. Jane is going to tell you what you can do to end this war in Indochina. And after I think the history that I've reminded you of tonight, there is no way for anyone to say, I believe, that an individual and a group of individuals can have no effect. That reason doesn't hold. I want to close by saying, I thank all of you to help me to do, finally, what I should have done much earlier. I give you that thanks, and I've asked Holly to sing a song that'll express that thanks for me, and I asked her to sing it after I spoke rather than before because it makes me cry when I hear it. But I thank you. Thank you.
Once we met a woman, she said, answer if you can. Do you mean we've been aggressing all this time in Vietnam? I thought that we'd been helping people fight to save their land. And her voice began to quiver as she cried. And her life began to change once she knew that they had lied. Oh, America, I now can say your name without feeling bitter and without feeling ashamed. I've traveled across your countryside, your cities and your towns, and I saw the friendly people come and turn my head around. And there's 9 verses, but there's another song. I wanted to sing that one because it related to Dan, and he'd asked me to. But since you're all warm, and I would like to move that song into the next one that I'd like to do, which is, "Oh America" was sung when people told us that we could never go out into the United States during the election and talk about Indochina, that we would be booed in every place we went. And so there's 9 or 10 verses of saying that didn't happen, that everywhere we went we were met with enthusiasm. But the most recent of those events was last spring at Kent State, Ohio, when there was a memorial event for the 4 students who had been killed. And another way, one of Nixon's reactions, he had to stop student activities. So he decided to scare us with murder. And we all gathered together there to remember them. Some students in Ohio, 200 yards away, shot down by an angry fire one early day in May. Some people cried out angry, you should have shot more of them down. But you can't bury youth, my friend. Youth grows the whole world around. It could have been me, but instead it was you. So I'll keep doing the work you were doing as if I were too. I'll be a student of life, a singer of songs, a farmer of food, and the righter of wrong. It could have been me, but instead it was you. And it may be me, dear sisters and brothers, before we are through. But if you can die for freedom, 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 if you can die for freedom, I can too. The junta took the fingers from Victor Jara's hands. They said to the gentle poet, play your guitar now if you can. Well, Victor started singing until they shot his body down. You can kill a man, but not a song when it's sung the whole world around. It could have been me, but instead it was you. So I'll keep doing the work you were doing as if I were too. I'll be a student of life, a singer of songs, the farmer of food, and the righter of wrong. It could have been me, but instead it was you. And it may be me, dear sisters and brothers, before we are through. But if you can sing for freedom, 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 if you can sing for freedom, I can too. A woman in the jungle, so many wars away, studies late into the night, defends a village in the day. Although her skin is golden, like mine will never be, her song is heard and I know the words, and I'll sing them till she is free, 'cause it could have been me, but instead it was you. So I'll keep doing the work you were doing as if I were too. I'll be a student of life, a singer of songs, the farmer of food and the righter of wrong. It could have been me, but instead it was you. And it may be me, dear sisters and brothers, before we are through. But if you can live for freedom, 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 if you can live for freedom, I can too. I want to do one more song, and then Jane is going to speak, and then we'll do some more music for those of you who can stay. This song has nothing to do with Indochina directly, but the reason I'm singing it was last year when I was traveling, I spoke with a lot of women's groups who said, well, in the 60s, there was so much sexism in the anti-war movement that we don't want to work in it anymore. And I thought that that was understandable, but sad that the understanding wasn't there, that no kind of liberation can happen in this country while we support a dictatorship abroad. And that it was very important for the women's movement to become very active in ending invasions into countries like the Philippines and Chile, and especially Indochina, and that the women of Indochina had a great deal to teach us about freeing themselves from first Confucianism and then colonialism and finally from US imperialism. And so I would like to sing a song not as some kind of proof, but only as a gesture of solidarity and friendship with women's movements who are working around the United States, which speaks of the strengths of women, and I hope that they can in turn put that kind of energy into participating in ending the continued war. Started out fine, we were moving ahead. I was driving the truck, you were combing the hair on the head of the one in the middle. She was loving it all, bouncing around like a rubber ball, and you thought she was just about the finest kid. I had to agree, but maybe that's 'cause she looks like me, and you were filling a space, maybe taking the place of a father. But when you started seeing that it might be a scene, you got to complaining, you got pretty mean. First it was the weather, and then it was me, and then you started taking it out on the baby. Well, if you think traveling 3 is a drag, well, pack up a loner. I've got my own bag full of dreams for this little child of wonder, and you can only stay if you start to understand how an old campfire gets warmer with you, but even when you're gone it still cooks the stew, and the coffee, it frees my soul, and I ain't ready to grow that old. Just say go home, lady, and find you a someone who's gonna turn into be a middle-class bum anyway. Well, he might make me some money, but that ain't the kind of life we're looking for, honey. So don't go around saying I've been a burden to you. You've been a burden to me, and we're through if you can't seem to find the joy in my living, can't seem to get into taking and giving, 'cause I got a little one who loves me as much as you need me, and darling, that's a loving enough for a hiking boot mother who's seeing the world for the first time with her own little girl.
Dan told me to tell you that he's going downstairs to talk to Bill Tilston, and he'll be right back up afterwards. After I speak, we're going to have some more music, and we're going to have, I hope, time for questions and answers. That is, if you want to stay, we're here to answer questions. I'll be brief because I know it's terribly hot in here. We've begun a kind of a mini tour, Dan and Holly and myself, and we're coming across people that we haven't seen since the fall of '72, when Holly and I and others were out telling people that if Nixon was going to be reelected, we'd be in big trouble. So a lot of people have been coming up to me and saying, well, do you feel vindicated? And I want to make one thing perfectly clear. No. No. We are not satisfied, and I don't think that you are satisfied with the resignation of President Nixon. We are not satisfied, nor are we satisfied with a cruel and incomplete amnesty program. We are men whose only crime was premature understanding of the nature of war, to begin with. We are not satisfied that 2 presidents have been deposed because enough Americans did not support their domestic or foreign policy. We are not satisfied by the fact that out of the almost 60 attempts on the part of the Justice Department to destroy, through the legal process, through courts, to destroy the organized resistance to American foreign policy in Indochina. Dan is an example, the Minneapolis 8 or other examples. We are not satisfied that when you tally up the scoreboard of these 60 attempts on the part of the Justice Department to destroy the anti-war movement, the scoreboard reads 60 for the anti-war movement and 0 for the Justice Department. We are not satisfied with the fact that we, Dan and I and other defendants or almost defendants, are able to speak and travel and address you while they are in jail or on their way to jail or just coming from jail. We are not satisfied with the fact that Ford's honeymoon is over. Why should we be surprised, since who of us ever accepted or condoned the marriage to begin with? We refuse to settle for appearances. We refuse to settle for the appearances of domestic reconciliation that Ford is trying to achieve through pardons and amnesty. We refuse to accept the appearances of peace. We feel that if we settle for appearances of any kind, that what we will be we will become is our cynics. And I feel this, I think, as strongly as I feel anything in my whole life. It's a very gut feeling because of where I've come from. I mean, I'm 37 years old, and I settled for a whole lot of appearances until I was about 31. I settled for appearances of success. I bought all of the myths, starting from way back when I was told that women couldn't change anything but diapers, that there could be no organized movement in this country, that it didn't matter what people did, that there was nothing that they could really change. I settled for the image of what women are supposed to be: glamorous, attractive, sexy, the Barbarella image. And I know what happens to people who accept those kind of appearances. You become apathetic, as I did. You become dead inside. I really, until only a few years ago, was a dead person. I looked like I had everything, right? I was famous. I had a lot of blonde hair and falsies and long eyelashes, and I'd made movies, and I was relatively well off. Only I was like a shriveled prune because I had no idea of who I was, my place in American society, what I could do to assume the mantle of responsibility that we should all assume in order to participate in an historical period. And Dan was talking about how finally what changes you is not intellectual concepts but emotional experiences. And For me, it was the war. It was a mass movement in this country that I was forced to come to terms with, because there were so many people in 1969 and 1970 who were marching, demonstrating, going to jail, having their heads bashed in. There were so many soldiers who had been to Vietnam and were coming back and were saying it's wrong. We are committing war crimes. The Vietnamese don't want us there. That loyalists and naive ones like me were forced to really think about what this country was about after all. And so I became a protester, which is important. I was against the war. But the big turning point for me was when I went a step beyond being a protester to beginning to find out who the people were that were fighting against the United States government and why they were fighting. It became a big problem for me to understand how it was that a country of peasants, an underdeveloped country of peasants, people who had started 30 years ago to fight against us with bamboo spears, had been able to do what no other people in the history of the world had done, and that is to defeat the U.S. empire. What was it? Even the Pentagon Papers and the State Department, as is testified to in the Pentagon Papers, even they constantly refer to this overwhelmingly popular movement in Indochina, supported by the majority of people who were prepared to sacrifice everything, including their lives. And I became fascinated by this. It was a kind of a commitment that I had grown up not ever knowing. And it was really through them and through what I learned about their commitment that I moved from being someone who protested the war to someone who was for something. I am for democracy. I am for, our democracy here. I am for independence. I'm for the right of people in this country and abroad to pick up arms if necessary in order to achieve their right of self-determination and national independence. And in the process of changing, I became super conscious of how the establishment in this country really turns us into apathetic people. We're not born apathetic. Anyone who has a baby knows that no one's born apathetic. You're born bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and then somewhere along the way, this idea is sort of fostered on us through our educational system, through the media, through actions by presidents who, for example, say that they don't care what happens in the streets, they just as soon watch football games on television. Accumulated stories like that, constantly being told that your actions don't make any difference, together with repression and fear, these kind of things turn us into apathetic people. But I believe that the apathy is skin deep. I know it's skin deep, being someone who had been apathetic, and I know that people can change very quickly, and that sometimes how can we not appear apathetic when we don't know what's going on, and we don't know that there's anything to do, and we don't see that there's any organized structure to plug into. I also think that it's harder for us than it is for any other people in any country of the world. We have a more powerful media, a more powerful system of manipulation than any other people in the world. And I remember in 1972 in July, when I was in North Vietnam during the time of very heavy bombing, something happened to me that I'll never forget. I was driving back to Hanoi from visiting a city called Binh Dinh, which had been totally demolished by U.S. bombs. And as we were driving down a country road heading back to Hanoi, there was a bombing. We heard the sirens and knew that there was a danger of planes coming. And the car stopped, and we all rushed out of the car, we meaning myself and the translator and the guide and the person who was driving the car, and started to get into these little individual shelters that lined the road. They're really holes, like manholes in the ground, that people would get into to try to protect themselves from the anti-personnel weapons. And I started to get into it. It was very muddy and it was filled with water at the bottom. And suddenly, a young girl with school books under her arm grabbed my hand and started pulling me down the street, running with me. I didn't know who she was. I went with her, and about 50 yards down the street, there was a little shack of a house, in front of which was a clean cement manhole, but the same size. And she gestured to me to get in very quickly. I saw that her mother and some younger children were running in another direction. I didn't want to get in because I realized that if I got into the shelter, it would mean that other members of her family wouldn't. But she insisted, and as I was about to protest again, the earth started to shake like this. There were explosions. I felt with my untrained ear that bombs were falling on top of us. They were, in fact, at the other side of the field, but I was scared to death, and I leapt inside this hole. She leapt in after me. There we were, me from tens of thousands of miles away and from the country that's bombing her country, and this young Vietnamese schoolgirl having to wrap ourselves into each other's bodies, our cheeks pressed together for what was maybe 4 or 5 minutes. We didn't say a word to each other. We just sat in this cement manhole, feeling the ground shaking. And when it was over and we crawled out again and we could see the smoke coming up from the other side of the field, she turned to me and she called the translator over, and she took my hand and she said to me, and it was translated by the translator, she said, "You have such a long struggle ahead in your country." I couldn't believe it. What it indicated to me was that this young, unknown Vietnamese girl, all she knew was that I was American. They had told her that I was an American. To me, it showed that this girl, and I felt this from many of the people that I met, was very clear about why her people were fighting and why they were resisting. She was very clear about who her enemy was. But she knew that we aren't so clear in this country about who our enemy is. And that in fact, although we are not under bombs and our lives are not in immediate danger, the struggle before us is far more difficult and far harder than hers. And that understanding that she expressed to me, which could have been any other amount of other things. It could have been hatred, resentment, anger, anything else. Instead, it was understanding and incredible friendship. I will never forget. It's one among many stories that have happened to me in the 2 times that I've been to Vietnam that have left very deep marks on me. The people I work with, the organization that I'm a full-time staffer of, called the Indochina Peace Campaign, we are, if you like, we are dedicated to not spawned more riots, more demonstrations, more school strikes, more schools were closed down than any other incident in American history. But what is going on today? Cambodia is still the largest war in the world. There are 300 deaths a day. Entire cities, ancient cities that will never be replaced, have been destroyed. Half the population are refugees. The population of Cambodia is the equivalent of New York City, and if the Cambodian War were being waged in New York City, the population of Manhattan would be dead. This is going on in Cambodia today, and yet we who risked our skins or our positions in 1971 to protest the war may not be paying too much attention to Cambodia right now. This is the kind of thing that we have to combat. And what we're saying is the situation is very different today than it was in the 1960s or the early 70s. Because of the mass demonstrations of the 60s, including riots in the streets, including any number of actions that many of us took part in, not so much me because I'm a latecomer, but that movement created a situation known as Watergate, which has provided us with a unique opportunity. And the opportunity wasn't over with the resignation of Nixon. The executive has been weakened. Congress has been somewhat encouraged and strengthened. And we have the chance to use new tactics to achieve what we partially achieved in the 60s, and we can go all the way. And that is to cut off the money that's paying for the war in Indochina. Because dictatorships that are waging the war, Lon Nol in Cambodia and Thieu in in South Vietnam receive 90% of their funding from the United States. The prisons are built with money from Food for Peace. The handcuffs come from Smith & Wesson in Massachusetts. The tear gas grenades comes from a factory in Pennsylvania. The computers that survey and create classified bio dossiers on 10 million people in South Vietnam come from El Segundo, California, from Computer Sciences Corporation. The tiger cages are built with our tax money. The guards are trained in torture tactics at the Police Academy in Washington. They are trained by U.S. advisors. The New York Times has reported that the CIA still is directly involved in the controlling and direction of the police system in South Vietnam. And monolithic as this empire may appear superficially, we have the unique opportunity, because we are Americans that are living in what is sometimes called the belly of the monster, to do what no other people in the world can do. Now, I've talked about Indochina. You know as well as I do, the same thing is happening on a lesser scale, a far lesser scale, in Chile, in Brazil, in Guatemala, in the Philippines, in most countries in the world that are governed by dictatorships, are ruled by dictatorships. We can, by a concerted, persistent, and unified effort, cut back little by little the funding that makes it possible for these dictatorships to survive. This is not to say, what I'm saying is that we can use conventional reform tactics that many of us eschewed 3 years ago, 4 years ago. But because of the effect of our actions in the 60s, we are able now to use these tactics to achieve fundamentally revolutionary goals, to chip away at American empire that is causing so much suffering and sorrow and death abroad. The B-52 bombing of Cambodia was stopped by one vote, by one vote. Now, for those of you who say that advocating pressuring Congress is a reform cop-out, imagine yourself as a Cambodian revolutionary or a Cambodian refugee or anybody that lives in Cambodia, and think how important it is that the B-52 bombing has stopped. Granted, people are dying in larger numbers in Cambodia today, but it is possible for the dictatorship in Cambodia to be weakened considerably because B-52s are not being dropped there anymore. Almost without exception, well, there have been 2 or 3 major exceptions, but all last year, as little by little we began to make inroads into the foreign aid going to Indochina, the votes were won, cutting back the aid by 1 vote, 2 votes, sometimes 3 or 4 votes. Tiny minorities. This is to show you how important every action is. The Indochina peace campaign, understanding that it was necessary for all people in any organization that had ever concerned itself with Indochina to get together, we organized a conference last fall called the United Campaign. War Resisters League, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, Clergy and Laity Concerned, the American Friends Service Committee, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and many, many others came together in Germantown, Ohio to form the United Campaign with a common strategy and a common program. Implement the peace agreement, cut aid to Thieu, release the political prisoners in Indochina, and achieve democracy in this country. We have common resources. We do common work together. In Minneapolis, the organization the most closely affiliated with the Indochina Peace Campaign is the North Country Peace Campaign, which is a project of NAM, working together with the American Friends Service Committee, the International Committee to Free South Vietnamese Political Prisoners, the Honeywell Project, and many others. What have we learned to do in a short year? And by the way, a year ago, I didn't know how the government worked. I didn't know about appropriation committees or authorization committees or how you got money cut or I had to learn from the ground up. You know, at my late age, I really did not know how the system worked, so how on earth could I use the system to achieve what I wanted? Last year when we were touring and I spoke in this hall, I was trying to urge people to support the amendment that would prohibit any U.S. funds from training foreign police or going to any country that supported political prisoners. It was an amendment by Senator Aberesk. At the time, I called him Aberzek. I didn't even know how to say his name, and I didn't really know how to explain to people how to go about the process. From this beginning, and it was a beginning, most of us had never done this kind of work before, we have developed into what the State Department calls in a confidential memo that it sent out to all congressional offices. It described the United Campaign as a sophisticated, long-term, well-coordinated, committed campaign to deprive Indochina, U.S. aid to the governments in Indochina. Now, we have cut, and when I say we, I mean in the broadest sense, the United Campaign, which has in turn involved Common Cause, the Nader people, the United Methodist Church, the National Council of Churches, the National Women's Political Caucus, the United Auto Workers, the United Mine Workers. We have systematically all around this country involved important interest groups, individuals, leaders in many areas to help us, and we have cut $1.5 billion from the administration requests. $1.5 billion has been kept out of the bloody paws of General Thieu in South Vietnam. It's very interesting when you're on the right track, well, you know when you're on the right track, when you start to come under very systematic criticism, a systematic attack. As we more and more began to reduce the aid, winning vote after vote, we cut $500 million last fall. The first thing that happened when Congress reconvened the next year is the Pentagon said there's going to be a communist offensive. We need quick an emergency supplemental $500 million to go to South Vietnam. It was defeated totally. As soon as that was defeated, there was suddenly an accounting error discovered, and the Pentagon, it turned out, had $250 million that it didn't know it had to go to South Vietnam. That was defeated, and on and on and on, until finally in the spring, with the largest anti-war majority ever in the history of Congress, since the war's been going on, U.S. aid, military aid to South Vietnam was reduced to $700 million. It had never been less than $1 billion before. Well, in the process, we've had Graham Martin, the ambassador to South Vietnam. We've had the State Department, a number of journalists all around the country have planted articles and statements in the Congressional Record and sent confidential memos saying that we are Hanoi lobbyists, that we should register as foreign agents, that we were preying upon, this is what Evans and Novak said, preying upon susceptible senators like Edward Kennedy, poor man. Even the POWs were brought out once again to testify just before an important aid vote to say that my tongue should be cut out and that I was a traitor, once again, speaking in favor of the military budget. Well, there have been enormous successes in the last year. I don't want to make it sound like it's very easy. As Dan Ellsberg said, it's a 30-year commitment on the part of a succession of U.S. administrations. There is more stake in Indochina than in any other part of the world, not just economic and political, but emotional. There's no place where there is more American emotion invested. The families of the men who died there, the families of the men who deserted not wanting to go there, those of us who protested. We've invested a lot of sorrow and tears and pain in that part of the world, and the government knows that, be it administration of Republicans or Democrats. How the war ends and how it is defined for the American people is going to determine a great deal about our future. The ability of any U.S. administration to ever again wage these kind of wars. When we end the war, as we will, by our own efforts, the efforts of the American people, not self-conscious efforts, efforts that we know we are carrying out so that when the war ends, we will be very aware of the role that we played. This is what has to happen. When we have done that, we will have probably struck the most profound and important blow to the system of empire. We will have made it that much more difficult for the United States to continue this kind of foreign policy, and that's what we have to do. People are hurting today, I know and you know, viscerally, much more from economic causes, an economic crisis in this country. That's really where Americans hurt today. on a more psychological level, where we really hurt is in the growing understanding that this is not a democracy, that our democratic rights are really threatened by our own government. What we are saying is that neither of these two major domestic problems can ever be solved or addressed until we attack the system of empire. How can inflation be solved? How can the budget deficit be resolved as long as more money is spent on military expenditures abroad? Anything that's called war against inflation that doesn't address itself to the military spending is in fact war against the American people, and the poorest of the American people. What it means is that it means that the cutbacks are coming from childcare, from schools, from medical care, from the things on which not Rockefeller's welfare, but most Americans' welfare depend. So we believe that in whatever else you're doing, whatever your principal concern is, spend some time to, first of all, become informed about what the United States is continuing to do. One of the ways you can do this is, quite simply, I guess the one that takes the least amount of effort, is to subscribe to a newspaper. It's called Focal Point. There are copies in the lobby, or maybe you were past them when you came in. This is a newspaper of the United Campaign and the Indochina Peace Campaign. It's the only newspaper that is entirely devoted to news and analysis of the war in Indochina and what people can do about it. I urge you to subscribe. Although it's the newspaper of the organization I work with, I know that whenever I feel I've fallen behind, not kept up enough with current events, this is what I turn to find out what's going on and what I can do. Number two, you can join the local peace campaign. You can do that if you're interested in actually working a lot or a little in a local campaign. You can sign the cards that have been passed out. They're cards that have check marks. One says, I'm interested in actually working. Another says, I'm interested in finding out more information. Please sign the cards so that you can be informed about local actions, important votes that are coming up, and so forth and so on. Besides signing the cards, those of you who can stay after this large meeting is over, we want to hold a smaller meeting to talk about very concretely, not questions and answers like this, but concretely how to form a group or relate to the already existing group in Minneapolis. So I invite you, after this is all over and everybody leaves who can't make those kind of commitments, to stay and talk about forming a local group. Someone is going to be, or a number of people are going to be passing collection cans. The collection cans are for two purposes. One of them is to collect the cards that you will have signed and to collect any donations that you can make. The donations go to keeping a national grassroots network of groups around the country functioning, going, keep the literature coming out, keep it possible for phone trees to be set up around the country, and so on and so forth. You all know that money is needed to keep an organization going. So we ask you to help in whatever way you can. It goes to both the national organization and to the local group. What else can you do? There is a very important vote coming up in November. It's called the Foreign Assistance Act, and the Foreign Assistance Act determines how much foreign aid goes to countries around the world. The most important part of the Foreign Assistance Act that we want to address ourselves to is the money that's going to Cambodia. Unlike most other countries, both the economic and military aid to Cambodia falls under the Foreign Assistance Act. It has been determined that if funding for Cambodia can be kept below 300 million, the Lon Nol regime may collapse, and peace will then come to Cambodia. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee has set a ceiling on funds for Cambodia of a little over 300 million, 200 million of which is for military purposes. It may seem like a lot, but given the economic crisis in Phnom Penh and given what unpopular dictatorships like this need to survive, it is sufficiently low to deal a staggering blow to Lon Nol. We urge you to pressure your representatives to support the ceiling that's been set by the Foreign Relations Committee on aid to Cambodia. Tell them 300 million maximum for Cambodia. It's very important. This is the year that we could actually end the war in Cambodia. There's another important event that will probably happen, which is that the United Nations is probably going to recognize finally Sihanouk as being the legitimate government of Cambodia. Those of you who don't know, Prince Sihanouk was the popular and constitutional leader of Cambodia until he was ousted by a CIA coup in 1970. It's a repeat of Chile and South Vietnam and a number of other countries. One more thing that you can do that is very important, both politically and on a human level. The State Department, and Mr. Kissinger in particular, have instituted deportation measures against 7 South Vietnamese students in this country. These are young students who came here with Agency for International Development scholarships. They're from South Vietnamese families. They came here relatively apolitical, and during the 5 or 6 years that they've been in this country, they have little by little turned against the war, turned against U.S. intervention in their country, and turned against and become very outspoken about the Q administration. They've gained a great deal of support in this country, particularly on the West Coast. They are remarkable people, and they've enriched all of our lives, those of us who have been fortunate enough to come in contact with them. They travel around at great risk, reading Vietnamese poetry, speaking to American people about the history of their country, why their people are fighting, why they have changed. If they are deported, according to these students, their lives will be in danger. They have ample reason to feel this danger. Only recently, 114 similar students on government scholarships were deported from Hong Kong. They fought deportation, but they lost. Saigon government promised that they would be well received, that they would be given jobs, that they would be paid, that they would earn a living, and yet they no sooner arrived, 118 of them arrived in Saigon, than all 118 of them were deported to the tiger cages on Con Son Island. And 14 of them, including a 2-year-old child and a 4-year-old child, have died. This is very recent. This is the kind of danger that these students are in. Not only that, if they are deported, if they lose their case, it will be a blow to other Vietnamese in many other parts of the country, Catholics, Buddhists, labor leaders, exiles, important political figures that have been exiled from South Vietnam. It will make it harder for them to speak out. The students are requesting temporary political asylum. Temporary. They don't want to stay in this country forever. They believe that their homes are in Vietnam, but they don't want to go back to Vietnam until their democratic liberties are guaranteed, until the peace agreement is implemented, and until they can be safe. The request for political asylum has been denied them because the executive, the State Department, the Pentagon, and the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization say that there is no basis to their contention that there is political repression in South Vietnam. It's terribly important that we support their demand for political asylum. You can write to the State Department, to Henry Kissinger, saying that you support their demands for political asylum because you know that there is political repression in South Vietnam. There are other things you can do. If you pick up some of the copies of Focal Point, you will see, I think it's the purple Focal Point, there is a brief resume of their case, and it lists places where you can write for more information, write to send contributions, write to pressure the Immigration and Naturalization Services. It's a case that has gained international attention. In Vietnam, reports on the case appear every day in the Saigon press. A lot of people are looking to see what is going to happen to these students, how well we can put ourselves between them and the government here and in South Vietnam. And I think we must prove to both parties that we don't accept the lies of either administration, that we know now, finally, the nature of the administration that we're supporting in South Vietnam, and that we will not tolerate these students being sent out of the country. I'm going to end now. I think we can sing some more songs together, and then I hope you'll stay for questions and answers. And again, don't forget that those of you who are interested in discussing the formation of a local peace campaign effort either on campus or in the community, please stay afterwards. Thank you.
Those people who have to leave, we hope you'll leave quietly so we can continue with question and answers and continue to have a fairly organized meeting here until it's over. So if you're going to go, I hope you'll go quietly. The thing I want to say that right now before I sing in the last song and then we get into questions is that this is very hard for me to say because it's about my own album. But we recorded an album so it could be used as an educational tool. Sometimes music is easier to get into people's lives than talk is. And an example of this is in Boston. There is an AM radio that the people who are organizing in Boston has got to play regularly on their AM radio, the song No More Genocide. And we thought this was a fairly incredible thing to have happened. And if you can use it as a tool like that, I think it could be real useful. Anyway, this is a song you just sing on and get up and stretch a little bit before you have to sit down again to do questions and answers. You gotta hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. I have learned so much about living since I've seen you stay alive. I used to feel, well, hell, it ain't worth it. But now, dear friends, I don't want you to die. You've got to hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years, you have been fighting. 27 years, you have been strong. The water held back by love and labor, dikes built by hand before my birth. Now if they break, you know you're gonna face hunger, so you move the mud to save the earth. But can you hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. Now when you farm, you hold a rifle, and when you sleep, you hold a child. When you fight to get a hold on to freedom, I'll feel stronger when I get to see you smile. But can you hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. There's a prison cell all filled with darkness you can't see, but still you smile. There ain't no darkness gonna block out your vision. You know that if you die, there's gonna be another child who's gonna hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. You gotta hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you can be strong. You gotta hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. You gotta hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 29 years you have been fighting, 29 years you have been strong. Okay, anybody wants to stay? I think they've gone to get Dan. Meanwhile, I'm going to ask Jane or I until he gets here any questions you like, and I guess I'll field them for a while unless we couldn't have been that complete. You must.
Does nobody have any questions? I can't believe it. There was someone that had a sign out there that said, "Go home, slobs." Do you have no questions? You have no questions? Poor soul. If you come with a sign like that, you should at least ask questions. You have a question? Yeah, you can come up and you can come here, and then I'll repeat your question. The question is in two parts. The first part, I believe, was addressed to the question of amnesty. Why should people who left the country, deserters or draft dodgers, be given amnesty? Why shouldn't Nixon be given the same treatment? Well, as far as I'm concerned, I'll try to make it as short and simple as possible. It may be difficult for some Americans to countenance or to agree to this now, because it means questioning a lot about our country's policies, but history will certainly show who are the criminals and who are the people who were true patriots. This country is a country that was founded on the principles of democracy and self-determination. It has now been proven through secret documents, government admissions, and so forth and so on, that what the United States was doing in Indochina was a violation of the rights of the Indochinese people. It was an attempt to deprive them of democracy, self-determination, and freedom, the very things that we fought for in this country 200 years ago. The men who refused to fight were doing so as part of a tradition, perhaps one of the most beautiful traditions in the world, the tradition that at least abstractly the country stands for, which is that we should not be depriving people of their freedoms. Nixon and his cronies not only were responsible for the deaths and suffering of approximately 6 million people in Indochina, they also were prepared to overthrow the U.S. Constitution, to break our laws, to undermine. They did not believe in the democratic system. I think that the statement that deserters and draft dodgers are required to sign, which says that in the future they will pledge allegiance to the United States, implying that in the past they were not patriotic, is really what Nixon should have to sign. I think Nixon is the one that has betrayed what the country stands for. The second part of the question said, why is it why this seeming imbalance that we show compassion for people in the anti-war movement who broke the law, when we don't show compassion for the Watergate defendants or for Agnew? Some laws are to be broken. Taking the lives of young American men for a war that was in the interests of nobody except the Rockefellers and the Fords and the large corporations in this country. These are laws that should be broken. But the crimes that were committed by Nixon, only some of which were raised in the Watergate investigation, I think the most heinous weren't even raised, which is the tolls of lives and suffering in Indochina. These are things that no American people, no individuals, and no left movement can there's no way to equate it. I think, imagine there was a time probably when General Custer we know General Custer was considered a hero. The slaughtering of Indians was condoned, and probably anyone who would have protested, no one did as far as I know, but if anyone had protested back in the early stage of our nationhood, had protested, they would be considered a traitor. But who today considers Custer a hero? Today, if we knew of anyone that had stood up and protested the slaughter and genocide of tribes of people in this country, would be considered a hero. And so the men who refused to go to war, or once in war refused to fight, will be considered the heroes, and the ones who fought and perpetuated the war will be the traitors to our people. Dan Ellsberg is here, so if questions can be directed to either one of us. The question is, don't we think that the peace movement is in pretty sorry shape when we have to advocate supporting a foreign aid bill that will send $300 million to Cambodia, $200 million of which is for military purposes. I'm a pragmatist in some senses, and I think if we want everything all at once, we'll get nothing. We have to, I think, learn from the Vietnamese and the Indo-Chinese that when you're struggling against a system, an empire, which has so much going for it, like military weapons and the media and the control of the educational institutions and so on and so forth, you have to carry on what they call a protracted struggle, where you chip away little by little. If we said we will settle for nothing short of a total elimination of all aid to Cambodia, we'd end up with nothing. We have to analyze what is the point at which Lon Nol will not be able to survive, or can survive with great difficulty, and we'll try to go for that, the lowest that is potentially achievable, and that's what we're talking about. We could put all our efforts into demanding a total aid cut, but no one would listen. None of the people who are in a position to actually cut the aid. You may say that the peace movement is in a pretty sorry shape. The Pentagon, the State Department, and the Ford administration doesn't think so. The State Department memo that I mentioned before that was circulated confidentially said the peace movement, and this may come as a big surprise, is as powerful as it was at the time of the Vietnam moratorium and the March on the Pentagon. Now, that may seem strange to us who got used to defining the peace movement by the numbers of hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. But again, it's a different time. Different tactics are needed. Fewer people in the streets doing different kinds of things can make more difference now because of what went on then. And they are right when they say we are a much more formidable force now because we know where the target is. We have our finger on the pulse of the empire, and they are fighting hard. They are fighting hard, and so are we. Another question, would I advocate violence for a change in policy? In Vietnam, yes. If I were Vietnamese, yes. I think that violence is a tactic which can be advocated in a country where the majority of people understand that all other avenues of change are closed to them. That's not the case in the United States. With all its problems and with all the cynicism that we hopefully have, or the skepticism about our government, there are still many, many avenues and ways in which we can use this system to achieve things little by little that will make an enormous difference. Not a total difference, but we have to think in terms of process. It's a process that is that's going to take a long time and be very difficult, but advocating armed struggle in the United States would mean that you would be lopped off from the majority of American people who will one day have to join you together to achieve any kind of real fundamental change. It means that you will become an unimportant fringe. I'm sorry, but history does support me. Yes, it does. History in this country and history in Indochina. The Indo-Chinese people only advocated picking up weapons when it was proven to the majority of them that there was nothing else they could do to achieve national dignity and independence and freedom. And even the Communist Party in Indochina, which had an enormous amount of power then and now, they would not let people, they told people, no, not armed struggle. This is not the time. This is not the time. And little by little, a mass movement was built. I mean, a truly mass movement was built before any question of arms came up. Now, you know, I'm saying this as a white middle-class American. It would be quite different, perhaps, if I were black living in a ghetto and my children were being eaten by rats and I was being shot at every day by police. There are reasons, I suppose, why some people in this country have to take up arms to defend themselves in self-defense, but armed struggle? No, not. Not now. Yes, are you? Yeah? Yes, thank you very much. He raised a very important question. He remembers that when the United States signed the peace agreement, the Paris Peace Agreement in January 1973, there was an article which says that the United States is obliged to pay reparations to North Vietnam for the damage that was done. And he says, is the United States paying this money for reconstruction, since we're sending so much to the Thieu administration in the South? The answer is no, we are not. The United States, once again, is violating the peace agreement by refusing to send funds to rebuild. And certainly the funds that are going to South Vietnam, by the administration's own admittance, is not going to rebuild or feed people or deal with the orphans or heal the wounds of war. By the administration's own admittance, almost only 2% of the money that's sent over there, the billions of dollars sent over there, goes for, quote, humanitarian reasons. The rest is used for military and paramilitary purposes.
We'll take one more question for Dan Ellsberg.
I don't know if this is appropriate for you, because Jada said that she believed that we had the right either to bear arms or to take up our struggle for our own liberty. The people have the right. We had a sister from the state who came along of arms in her personal struggle. And I wonder what extent or at what time would that ever seem to be appropriate? Are we talking about peace in a general thing? Where we talk like it's our right to embrace humanity?
Yeah. Could you hear the question? Okay, the question is, it's very hard to hear up here, but I could hear that. The question is, at what point do the people have a right to take up arms for armed struggle? Obviously, the right to possess arms is one of the measures of the Bill of Rights. And the reason it's there, obviously, is that this country was born in armed struggle against a tyrant to whom previously all the founders of our Constitution and Revolution had given allegiance, and by whom they were considered traitors when they went into revolution. As you know, the Declaration of Independence, I think, defines for you the terms, when in the course of human events. Basically, these human rights, to paraphrase, are abridged, and there is no other alternative. The costs that the Vietnamese people have had to endure in their armed struggle against a power vastly more rich, powerful, and inhumane in its actions than the England of George III, I think underline the point that armed struggle is not something for any country, any people, to take up lightly or prematurely or romantically. It's hard for us to judge what their alternatives were, and they weren't very good. But the price they are paying for their resistance is measured in millions of lives, and they haven't won totally, although they have not been defeated despite our biggest efforts, and they are still resisting us, and they will win. I have no doubt of that. Apply that to our country. The country they're fighting is this country. The bombs are American bombs and could be turned on the citizens of this country, just as the CIA has been turned on citizens in this country already, and the FBI. So long as there is alternatives for preserving freedoms and for changing things in this society by using the freedoms we still have left, I would think the case for armed struggle is extremely bad, and I think that is the case today. I think what Nixon shows us is the nearness that we are to a drastic change in our constitutional order. It's limited in terms of freedoms and very bad in terms of justice already today. But it could get much worse, and I think Nixon showed us how close we were to its getting much worse. And the responsibility would be a heavy one for tossing this country into the kind of country that Nixon, I believe, was prepared to project us into. an openly militaristic and fascist state. I think what we should have learned in the last couple of years, the last year, is that we do have freedoms yet to exploit and to change this society, and it's our responsibility to each other and to ourselves to show more humane values and better principles than the men who run this government have shown, so that we will not become like them and we will not reproduce the society that they have given us. That's up to us. One more question. I'm coming here late. Yes.
The second is violating the law when you let out the Pentagon Papers. Is it against the law now, or versus they pass a law?
No, that's a good question. Is it now against the law to do something like the Pentagon Papers, since, as I asserted, it was not when I did it? The answer is, of course, they are more conscious. The administration is more conscious than before of their need, as they see it, for such a law if they're to carry on secret wars against the interests of the American people and of others and keep them secret. Their need for better secrecy control is getting more evident all the time. Therefore, they have put forth a draft of a law, S-1400, which deserves attention in your letter writing to senators, and there's a House bill corresponding to that, which would correspond to an Official Secrets Act and would make illegal what I was indicted for doing for the first time. Now, other countries have such an act, even England, which is relatively democratic, but which didn't have the American Revolution even, and doesn't have a Bill of Rights. They do instead have an Official Secrets Act. We don't. And I think the chance is less than it used to be that Congress will pass such an act and thereby repeal the First Amendment and change our entire democratic structure. Because the day we lose that particular amendment, then the ability of the public to learn what the government is doing with their funds and in their name will be less than it is already. And it's already so little that we've lost democratic control of our foreign policy, and the issue is up to us to regain it. But at least we have the letter of the law still on our side, and if we let the congressmen know that we are watching them and that we demand that they protect the Constitution in this respect, I think we can keep that letter of the law, and that's worth doing. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. People who want to, we're going to be holding a brief meeting shortly, in a couple of minutes, for people who want to begin working to join the United Campaign, to help us in our local efforts to cut off aid to Thieu, implement the peace agreement. So those people who are interested in doing that work for the coming period, please stay and we'll meet right in the front of the stage.